Nobody told Leonard Cole that he was about to watch an empire admit it had failed. He was 19 years old, sitting in a water-filled ditch outside a Dutch village called Driel, and the only thing he knew for certain was that his boots had been wet for 3 days, and that the river in front of him was full of men who were supposed to win the war. They came across in rubber boats in the dark, British paratroopers, the Red Berets, the finest soldiers the British Army had produced in a generation. Men who had been dropped at Arnhem 9 days earlier with orders to hold a single bridge for 48 hours while Montgomery's armored columns raced up the road to relieve them. 48 hours. That was the plan. 9 days later, Leonard Cole was watching what was left of them come across the Rhine in groups of 5 and 10, some without rifles, some without boots. One man crossing with nothing but a pistol and a look in his eyes that had no name in any language Leonard had been taught. 17,000 men had gone into Arnhem. Fewer than 2,000 came back. The rest were dead, captured, or still hiding in Dutch attics, praying that the family above their heads would not be discovered by the soldiers searching the street below. Montgomery's great thrust, the single bold stroke that was supposed to end the war by Christmas and deliver Germany to the Allies on a schedule, had drowned in the Rhine. And with it drowned something that no communique and no press release would ever admit, the belief that this war still had an easy ending. Leonard Cole did not know that yet, but he was about to learn it the way soldiers always learn the truth, not from a general, from a river full of broken men. 3 weeks after Arnhem, the Americans discovered the same lesson with their own blood in a place called the Hurtgen Forest. It does not appear in Hollywood films. It does not appear on memorials in Washington. It is the war that American memory quietly buried because what happened there does not fit the story of the liberating army that swept across Europe in triumph. 33,000 American soldiers walked into that forest between October and December of 1944. The Germans had been preparing it for months. Minefields under every layer of fallen leaves, artillery pre-ranged on every trail and clearing, bunkers built into hillsides that absorbed direct hits and kept firing, and the trees themselves became a weapon, shells detonating against the canopy and exploding downward in showers of splinter and steel that no helmet could stop. Men who survived Omaha Beach did not survive the Hurtgen Forest. 33,000 casualties, for ground that could be measured in yards, for a breakthrough that never came. Eisenhower's staff looked at those numbers and said nothing publicly, but the mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore. The replacement pipeline was running dry. The divisions that were supposed to be rested were exhausted. The supply routes that stretched back to Normandy were feeding a machine that was starting to stall. And then, on December the 16th, the Germans did something that Allied intelligence had declared impossible. 200,000 soldiers, armor that was supposed to have been destroyed months ago, and an offensive through the Ardennes that tore a hole in the American line 80 miles wide. The Battle of the Bulge. 3 weeks of crisis. Generals overruled, divisions surrounded, Patton turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard to plug a gap that should not have existed. The Bulge was stopped, but the cost of stopping it left the American forces in the South shattered, depleted, and incapable of mounting any serious offensive before spring. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was now a war with no visible end. And here is the fact that every history book mentions in passing and then moves on from, the fact that changes everything if you actually stop and think about it. While all of this was happening, while Arnhem was collapsing, and the Hurtgen was consuming American divisions, and the Bulge was pushing Eisenhower to the edge of crisis, there was one Allied army that was not resting, not rebuilding, not waiting for better weather or better orders or a better assignment. The 1st Canadian Army was in the Scheldt Estuary, doing the one piece of work that the entire Allied advance depended on and that nobody in London or Washington wanted to talk about. The port of Antwerp had been captured in September, the largest port in Western Europe, capable of supplying everything. But a port means nothing if the enemy controls the river that leads to it. The Germans knew this. They flooded the polders deliberately, turned 60 miles of estuary into a landscape that was not land and not water, but something in between, a freezing brown nothing that swallowed men to the waist and offered no cover and no solid ground and no mercy. They fortified every island, every dike, every fragment of raised earth with concrete and wire and artillery and soldiers who had been told to die there. Eisenhower needed that port to continue the war. The casualty projections for clearing it were so brutal that the assignment sat on the planning table for weeks while commanders found reasons to look the other way. Then it went to the Canadians, not as an honor, not as a recognition of their ability. It went to the Canadians because the terrain was so horrific and the cost so certain that no one else would take it. Leonard Cole went into that water in October. He came out in November. In between, the 1st Canadian Army took 11,000 casualties in a battle that lasted 40 days and that most people who consider themselves knowledgeable about the Second World War cannot name. 11,000 men in a place most people cannot find on a map. And when it was over, when the last German position had been taken and the minesweepers had cleared the channel and the first supply convoy had entered the port of Antwerp, the logistical crisis that had been quietly strangling the Allied advance simply disappeared. The fuel flowed. The ammunition flowed. The advance that would eventually end the war became possible again, because of 11,000 Canadian casualties in a flooded estuary that history barely mentions. Leonard Cole dried his socks on a farmhouse radiator for 20 minutes. Then a corporal named Walsh from Brantford, Ontario, a man who had already fought in Sicily and Italy and who had been in the army since 1940, handed him a map of the Rhineland and pointed to a forest on the German border. Walsh looked at the forest for a long time. He looked at the German defensive lines marked along its edge. He looked at the terrain, the rivers, the towns, the roads that led nowhere useful. He folded the map, he handed it back, and he said the sentence that is the entire story of the Canadian Army in the last year of the Second World War. He said, "Well, somebody has to do it." There was no glory in that sentence. There was no anger. There was no pride in the performative sense, no chest beating, no speech about duty and nation. There was only the flat, exhausted, professional acceptance of men who learned that the weight nobody wanted always ended up in the same hands, theirs. The British had Arnhem, the Americans had the Bulge, the Canadians had everything in between, everything that was too dirty, too costly, too unglamorous for the history books, too essential to leave undone. And in the winter of 1944, as the Allied command regrouped and rebuilt and planned its final push into Germany, the 1st Canadian Army stood at the edge of the Rhineland and looked at what was coming next. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They loaded their weapons, checked their boots, and waited for the order. Because somebody had to do it, and they stopped pretending it would be anyone else. There is an archive in Ottawa that almost nobody visits. Inside it, in a box that has not been opened by a researcher in 11 years, there is a small notebook that belonged to a sergeant named Patterson of the Regina Rifles. It is not a diary. It has no poetry in it, no reflections on the meaning of war, no letters to a wife or a mother. It is a working document, a list of names. On February the 8th, 1945, the list has 22 names on it. By February the 14th, it has 15. By February the 21st, it has 9. Next to each removed name is a single word: evacuated, killed, evacuated, killed, killed, killed. Nobody has made a film about that notebook. Nobody has written a best-selling book about the men on that list, or the forest that removed them from it. The Reichswald does not appear in the popular imagination of the Second World War, the way Normandy does, or the way the Battle of the Bulge does. It does not have a famous photograph, or a famous speech, or a famous general standing in front of a map explaining why it mattered. What it has is that notebook, and 14 names that made it to the end. Private Danny Kowalski of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada is lying in a frozen ditch 100 yards from the tree line on the morning of February the 8th, 4:30, still dark, and the silence before a barrage is a specific kind of silence that every soldier learns to recognize because it is the last silence before the world changes. Danny has been in the army for 3 years. He fought at the Scheldt 2 months earlier, where the water came up to his chest and the mud tried to swallow his boots with every step, and he came out of that believing he now understood what the war was capable of doing to a man. He was wrong. The Reichswald is not the Scheldt. The Scheldt was geography used as a weapon. The Reichswald is architecture. The Germans had spent months building it into a fortress so carefully designed that it almost did not need soldiers to defend it. The fields on both sides of the forest had been deliberately flooded, channeling any advancing army directly into the trees with no alternative route. Every path, every clearing, every gap between the trunks had been pre-registered as an artillery coordinate, so that the moment a man appeared in any open space, shells were already assigned to that exact point. Bunkers had been built into the hillsides with overlapping fields of fire, positioned so that destroying one revealed the next, and the next after that, an infinite series of concrete problems that had to be solved one at a time by men walking into them. Wire had been strung at throat height in the darkness between the trees, invisible until it was too late. And the Germans had understood something about forest warfare that no training manual explained adequately, something that the Americans had already learned at a catastrophic cost in the Hurtgen forest 2 months earlier. When an artillery shell explodes on open ground, the blast goes downward and men in foxholes survive. When a shell hits the canopy of a dense forest, it detonates in the air, and the explosion goes outward and downward simultaneously, and every fragment of wood and steel becomes a projectile traveling at lethal velocity in every direction at once. There is no foxhole deep enough. There is no position safe enough. The trees become the shrapnel. The forest becomes the gun. The Americans lost 33,000 men learning that lesson in the Hurtgen. 33,000. For ground you could measure in yards, for a breakthrough that never came. And when that forest was finally abandoned as a strategic objective too costly to justify, the Allied line shifted north, and the Reichswald was waiting. Danny Kowalski knew what was in those trees. Every man in his section had been briefed. The knowledge did not help. At 4:30 in the morning on February the 8th, the barrage began, and it was unlike anything that had preceded it in the war, because Lieutenant General Guy Simmons had looked at the terrain and at the casualty projections and had decided that if the forest was going to be a weapon, then the Canadians would answer it with a weapon that the Germans had never encountered from any Allied army. He could not move his armor across the flooded fields. He did not send infantry across open ground under fire. So he turned everything he had into a single instrument of obliteration. Every tank in range, every anti-aircraft gun, every anti-tank gun, every heavy machine gun was given coordinates and a time and ordered to fire simultaneously in a technique the Canadians called the pepper pot. A standard artillery battery fires 2 or 3 rounds per minute. A Sherman tank crew at maximum effort fires 10 to 12. Multiply that by an entire armored regiment, add the anti-aircraft guns and the heavy machine guns and the mortars, all firing at once at pre-registered positions, and what reaches the German lines is not a barrage in any sense that experienced soldiers recognize. There are no gaps, there are no pauses. There is no rhythm to read, no 30-second window to sprint between positions, no moment when a veteran's instinct says now, move now. The veterans in those Reichswald bunkers, men who had survived the Eastern Front by learning to read Allied fire patterns like a language, pressed themselves against the concrete and waited for the pause that never arrived. And then the Canadians stood up and walked into the trees. What followed over the next 3 weeks does not fit the grammar of heroic war narrative. It was not a dramatic breakthrough. It was not a single decisive engagement that turned the battle. It was attrition in its purest and most expensive form, the grinding yard-by-yard destruction of a prepared defensive line by men who had no option other than to continue, because stopping meant dying in place, and dying in place helped nobody. The 1st Parachute Army defending the Reichswald were not the scraps of a broken military. They were professionals defending their own border with detailed knowledge of the ground and orders that did not include the word retreat. Every position had to be taken individually by the men directly in front of it, under canopy that turned every incoming shell into an overhead explosion, through mud that arrived with the February thaw and immediately made every vehicle road impassable and every step a negotiation with the earth. The thaw is the detail that the histories skip past and that the men who were there could not stop thinking about for the rest of their lives. The ground that had been frozen solid on February the 8th turned within days into a substance that had no adequate name. Tanks that had survived the Scheldt sank to their hulls. Supply vehicles that had been managing the frost roads drowned in the slurry overnight. Men who had been fighting for days without sleep now carried their own ammunition through knee-deep mud because there was no other way to get it forward, and the line still had to move, because the line always had to move. Sergeant Patterson updated his notebook in the evenings when there was light enough to write. He did not editorialize. He wrote names and dates and 1 word each. The notebook does not tell you how Corporal Reed was killed on February 12th or what Private Arsenal looked like when he was evacuated on February 16th. It tells you only that they were there and then they were not. That is the Reichswald in its entirety. Men who were there and then they were not. Danny Kowalski came out on February 28th. He had gone in with 31 men. He came out with 14. He sat on the hood of a truck on a road outside the German town of Gach, which the Canadians had taken 4 days ago in street fighting that appeared in no newspaper his family in Hamilton would ever read. And a signals officer passing through offered him a cigarette and asked what the forest was like. Danny Kowalski took the cigarette. He looked back at the tree line, still visible from the road, still smoking in 2 places, still marked by the black gaps where the bunkers had been burned out, one by one, over 3 weeks of work that history would file under a heading nobody remembers. He thought about 14 names. He thought about Patterson's notebook and the single word written next to each of the ones that did not make it. He said, "It is done." Then he asked if there was any coffee. There is a moment in the history of the Second World War that does not appear in any film, and that most people who consider themselves serious students of the conflict have never encountered, because it contradicts almost everything the popular narrative of that war was built on. It happened in April of 1945 in the occupied Netherlands, and it involved a Canadian general sitting across a table from a German general, not to negotiate surrender, not to discuss prisoner exchanges, but to agree on a temporary ceasefire so that food could be dropped from aircraft to Dutch civilians who were dying of starvation by the thousands while the war continued around them. The German general's name was Johannes Blaskowitz. The Canadian general's name was Charles Foulkes. They shook hands, and for a few days in the final weeks of the most destructive war in human history, the shooting stopped so that bread could fall from the sky. This is the chapter that the story of the Canadian Army does not prepare you for, because the army that negotiated that ceasefire was the same army that had taken no prisoners from the SS in Normandy, the same army that had walked into the Scheldt with the water at chest height and kept walking, the same army that had just spent 3 weeks dismantling the Reichswald bunker, bunker by bunker. The hardest infantry on the Western Front sat down with the enemy and made a deal to save civilians, and it worked. To understand why that moment exists, you have to understand what the Netherlands had become by the winter of 1944 to 1945. The Hunger Winter began in September of 1944, when the German occupation authorities cut off all food supplies to the Western Netherlands in retaliation for a Dutch railway strike called in support of the Allied advance. The railway workers had struck because the liberation seemed imminent, because Market Garden appeared to be succeeding, because it seemed like days before the occupation ended. Then Market Garden failed. The trains stopped, and the Germans stopped the food. By November, the daily calorie ration in Amsterdam and Rotterdam had fallen below 1,000 calories. By January, it was below 500. People were eating tulip bulbs. They were eating sugar beets intended for livestock. The streets of Dutch cities that had been civilized and prosperous 4 years earlier were being walked by people whose bodies were consuming themselves, whose children were born underweight and died within days, whose elderly neighbors simply did not wake up one morning. By the spring of 1945, an estimated 20,000 Dutch civilians had died of starvation. The number was accelerating. The 1st Canadian Army knew this. The soldiers fighting through the Netherlands could see it with their own eyes. They could see the civilians in liberated towns who were skeletal, who reached for the rations the soldiers carried with a desperation that had moved beyond pride into something more fundamental. And they were fighting an enemy who controlled the food supply of millions of people and who showed no indication of releasing it, regardless of the military situation. It was the Canadian command that proposed the direct approach, not a back channel, a direct communication to the German command, proposing a temporary local ceasefire to allow food delivery to the civilian population. The proposal went through the International Red Cross and arrived on Blaskowitz's desk. Blaskowitz was not a true believer. He had been reprimanded by Hitler in 1940 for filing formal complaints about SS atrocities in Poland. He was a professional soldier who had watched his country commit crimes he had documented and been punished for documenting, now commanding the remnants of an army in a war he knew was finished. When the Canadian proposal arrived, he did not forward it to Berlin for approval. He knew what Berlin would say. He made the decision himself. The meeting took place on April 28th at a schoolhouse in the Dutch town of Achterveld. Volks and his staff on one side of the table, Blaskowitz and his staff on the other. Between them, physically on the table, were maps showing the food drop corridors, the agreed flight paths, the altitudes at which Allied aircraft would fly, the guarantee that German anti-aircraft guns would not fire on them. 2 enemies sitting down to agree on the terms of mercy. The agreement created what became known as Operation Manna. Beginning on the 29th of April, RAF and RCAF bombers that had spent the previous years dropping explosives on German cities began flying at low altitude over occupied Dutch cities, dropping food, bread, canned meat, chocolate, margarine, falling from aircraft that flew so low the crews could see the faces of the people below looking up. The Dutch civilians who came into the streets knew what these aircraft were. They had heard them for years flying overhead in the dark on their way to Germany. They had lost family members to Allied bombs that had missed their targets, and now the same aircraft were dropping food. Civilians stood in open fields waving anything white they had, sheets from their beds, tablecloths, curtains pulled from windows. A Dutch woman named Hendrika van der Berg, who was 16 years old in April of 1945, described it 60 years later. She said her mother had been too weak to come outside. She said her younger brother had not eaten a full meal in 4 months. She said she stood in the street and watched a Lancaster bomber fly over so low she could see the roundels on the wings and the bomb bay doors open, and the food fell out, and she sat down on the pavement in the middle of the street and could not stand up again for a long time. She said it was not hunger that put her on the ground. It was the sudden, unbearable understanding that it was going to be over, that they had survived. Captain Robert Myers of the Royal Canadian Regiment wrote a letter home on May 2nd. He had been in the Army since 1941. He had fought in Italy and Normandy and the Rhineland. He wrote, "We dropped food on them today. Not us personally, but our aircraft. I watched from a field. The people came out of the houses. I cannot describe what they looked like. I will not try." He paused in the letter, and you can see the pause because the ink changes, as if he stopped and came back. He wrote, "I did not know this was something armies could do." The Canadian Army that negotiated the Hunger-Winter ceasefire was the same army that cleared the Scheldt and broke the Reichswald. The same men, the same units, the same command structure. The objective in front of you is the only thing that matters. Do what is required to achieve it. In the Scheldt, it required walking into freezing water. In the Reichswald, it required dismantling a forest one bunker at a time. In the Netherlands, in April of 1945, it required sitting across the table from the enemy and making a temporary peace. The same army, the same principle, different costs. When the formal liberation came on May 5th and the Canadian columns rolled into the cities, the soldiers were not entirely sure what to do with what they were receiving. A corporal named Beauchamp from Trois-Rivières described it later. He said the women were putting flowers on his tank, and the children were climbing on the hull, and an old man grabbed his hand through the hatch and would not let go, and was saying something in Dutch that Beauchamp could not understand. He asked his interpreter what the man was saying. The interpreter said, "He is saying thank you for the bread." Beauchamp said he had not personally dropped any bread. He had been in a field outside the city during the food drops. He had been fighting. He had not done that particular thing. The interpreter said it didn't matter. To the man holding his hand, every Canadian was the bread.
The date is May the 2nd, 1945, 3 days before the end of the war in the Netherlands. Near a small village called Giefsweer in the northern Dutch province of Groningen, a Canadian soldier named Private William Breckenridge is moving through a ditch along a flooded field toward a German position that has been holding up his company for 6 hours. He does not know that Germany has lost the war. He does not know that surrender negotiations are already happening 40 miles to the south. He does not know that in 72 hours the shooting will stop and the Netherlands will be free. All he knows is that there is a machine gun in a farmhouse at the end of this field, and that it has already killed 2 men from his section this morning, and that somebody has to deal with it. He deals with it. He is killed doing so. His name is on a headstone in a military cemetery outside Groningen. Most people who visit that cemetery cannot tell you who he was. Most people who know the story of the liberation of the Netherlands do not know that the last Canadian soldier died 3 days before it was officially over, in a ditch, in a field, for a farmhouse, against an enemy that had already conceded the war in every meaningful sense except the document that made it final. This is the chapter nobody tells. Not because it is secret, because it does not fit the story that everyone wants, the one that ends with flowers on tanks and children waving flags and old men weeping in the streets of Amsterdam. That story is true, and it happened, but it happened on top of a foundation that was still being paid for in blood on the 2nd of May, while the celebration was already being written in the newspapers back home. William Breckenridge did not make it into any of those photographs. The German forces remaining in the Netherlands in April and May of 1945 were not a coherent army executing a rational strategy. They were fragments. Kriegsmarine coastal troops with no orders beyond manning their guns. SS garrison units who applied every instruction with a literalism that made surrender functionally unavailable to them. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers who wanted desperately to put their hands up but were surrounded by officers who would shoot them for attempting it. And scattered through all of them, the truest believers, men who had absorbed the Reich so completely into their identity that its collapse felt not like a military defeat, but like a personal extinction. These were the men the Canadians were still fighting in the first days of May. The Delfzijl pocket sat in the northeastern corner of the Netherlands on the coast, a fortified enclave of approximately 12,000 German soldiers who had been bypassed by the main Canadian advance and who were now surrounded, cut off, and still fighting across flat, open terrain that offered no cover and no approach that did not cross ground pre-ranged by positions the Germans had been improving for months. The 2nd Canadian Division was given the job of reducing it. The soldiers who went into that operation knew the war was ending, and that knowledge, rather than making the danger easier to bear, made it in certain ways the hardest thing the war had yet asked of them. There is a specific kind of fear that belongs only to the last days. It is different from the fear of the middle, when death is so constant that the mind builds armor against its full weight. The fear at the end is more precise. It sounds like this: what if it is me? What if after everything, after Sicily and Italy and Normandy and the Scheldt and the Rhineland, what if the last bullet in this war has my name on it? What if I am William Breckinridge in the ditch outside Giefsweer? A corporal named Vincent Tran from the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry wrote to his brother on April 30th. He wrote, "We know it is nearly finished." And somehow that makes the men more careful and more frightened than they have been in months, because before you could tell yourself that dying was just what happened here, and you had accepted it, and now you cannot accept it anymore, because you can see the end from here, and the distance between you and it is exactly the distance across this open field with that machine gun in the farmhouse at the other end. He crossed the field. He survived. The men in that letter were the lucky ones. The formal German surrender in the Netherlands was signed at Wageningen on May the 5th. 40 miles to the north, at the same hour, Canadian soldiers were still clearing the last positions of the Delfzijl pocket under fire because the order had not yet reached the men inside, and until it did, they kept shooting. A sergeant named De Rochers from the Fusiliers Mont Royal stood at a crossroads outside Delfzijl watching several hundred German soldiers walk past him into captivity. He thought about the men in his company who would not be standing with him. He thought about Breckinridge, who died 3 days ago for a farmhouse in a field in a province most people at home could not find on a map. He felt something that did not have a clean name, something between grief and exhaustion and the flat recognition that the distance between the first Canadian who died on Juno Beach and the last Canadian who died outside Giefsweer did not make the last death easier than the first. It made it harder, because the first death happened when the end was invisible. The last death happened when the end was 3 days away and close enough to touch. The Canadians who were still alive went into the liberated cities and received what the Dutch gave them: flowers on tank hulls, children lifted up to soldiers who had never held a child in their lives. The gratitude was real and permanent and has not faded in the 80 years since. The Dutch maintain Canadian graves with a devotion that shames the countries that sent the men who fill them. But in the hours immediately after the surrender, the men who had been in the last battles sat with a silence that did not have a performance in it. A private named Gallagher from New Brunswick, who had fought from Normandy to Delfzijl, sat in a Dutch farmhouse on the evening of May the 5th. He opened his notebook. He wrote 3 words. He crossed them out. He wrote them again and left them. The words were, "We are done." Not "we won," not "it is over," not any of the phrases that fill the official histories and the memorial speeches. We are done. Gallagher closed his notebook. Outside the window, the Dutch landscape was flat and dark and completely still. No artillery, no aircraft. Just the Netherlands in the first evening of peace, smelling of mud and water and the very beginning of spring. He listened to the silence for a long time. Then he went to sleep. In the summer of 1945, a reporter named Gerald Clark, who worked for the Montreal Standard, traveled through the Netherlands, interviewing Canadian soldiers waiting to be sent home. He was looking for the triumph. He found it,
But he also found something he had not expected, something his editors buried on page 11 because it did not fit the tone of the victory coverage. He found that the soldiers did not talk about the war the way the newspapers had been describing it. They talked about mud. They talked about specific men who were not there anymore. They talked about the Scheldt and the Rhineland and places that nobody back home had read about in any newspaper during any week of the war. And when Clark asked how they felt about what they had accomplished, most of them did not have a ready answer, not because they did not know, but because nobody had ever asked them before. The 1st Canadian Army finished the Second World War having liberated more territory in the final months than any other Allied force on the Western Front. They cleared the Scheldt and opened the port that made the final advance into Germany logistically possible. They broke the Reichswald and tore open the last prepared defensive line protecting the German heartland from the northwest. They negotiated the ceasefire that allowed food to reach 1 million Dutch civilians who were dying of starvation. They reduced the last German pockets of resistance while the rest of the Allied world was already writing the victory narrative. And they did all of it without a famous general whose name every schoolchild knows, without a single battle that appears in the standard popular history of the war, without a photograph that became an icon. The American story of the war has Omaha Beach and Patton and the flag on Iwo Jima. The British story has Dunkirk and Montgomery at El Alamein. The Canadian story has a port that needed opening, and a forest that needed clearing, and a people that needed feeding, and a job that needed finishing. And the men who did those things came home to a country that was proud of them in a general, unfocused way that did not require knowing what they had actually done. A veteran named Harold Moffat from Winnipeg, who served with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles from Normandy to the end, gave an interview to a community newspaper in 1967. The interviewer asked what he thought the Canadian contribution to the war had been. Moffat was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We did the work." The interviewer asked him to elaborate. Moffat said, "When something needed doing and nobody else could do it, or nobody else wanted to do it, they sent us." He paused. He said, "I am not complaining. That is just what happened." That sentence is the most precise description of the Canadian Army in the Second World War that anyone has ever produced. Not a boast, not a grievance, a statement of fact. The Germans had a phrase for it that appears in multiple intelligence assessments from 1944 and 1945. They called it the Canadian tempo, the pace at which the Canadian Army moved and fought and refused to stop. Not always the fastest, but consistent in a way that the Germans found more frightening than speed. It did not have off days. It did not have periods where the pressure relaxed. It just kept coming at the same pace, regardless of casualties, regardless of weather, regardless of whether the assignment was survivable on paper. That consistency was built from something that cannot be manufactured by training alone. It was built from men who had volunteered for a war that was not happening in their country, who had crossed an ocean because they decided the thing they had come to do was worth finishing regardless of what finishing it cost. The Dutch know what that cost. Walk through any Dutch city today and you will find streets named for Canadian regiments, monuments in town squares, Dutch families who have maintained contact with the families of the liberators for 80 years. The bond between Canada and the Netherlands is one of the most durable relationships between two nations in the modern world, built not on trade or politics, but on the specific memory of what it felt like to be starving, and then to see a Lancaster fly over your city so low you could see the roundels on the wings and watch the food fall out. Harold Moffat went back to Winnipeg. He went back to work. He did not write a memoir. He lived to be 87. At his funeral in 1996, his daughter read a passage from a letter he had written to his mother from the Netherlands in May of 1945, found in a shoebox in a closet after he died. The letter was dated May the 8th. It was one paragraph. He wrote, "We are coming home soon. I cannot tell you everything that happened here, because some of it I do not have words for yet, and some of it I may never have words for. But I want you to know that we did what we came to do. Not the way anyone wrote about it, the way it actually needed doing. That is enough. That is what it cost. That is what it was worth." He did not know his letter would sit in a shoebox for 50 years. He did not know that nobody would make a film about the Scheldt, or the Reichswald, or the Delfzijl pocket, or any of it. He just knew that it was done, and that it had needed doing, and that they were the ones who did it, and that those three things together were the whole story, even if nobody ever told it properly.